we're talking about the preparation of the tour to take place this year for the anniversary of Birger's hanging. What year would it be? 80? Which anniversary?
88.
88th anniversary. And of course, at the 100th anniversary, we're going to take the actual gallows and reconstruct them and find a young man who looks like Charlie Birger. So here you had Charlie Birger was incarcerated in Franklin County Jail for a year and had the best of lawyers and arguably all the sins of the camp. While he did some very bad things, he was involved with other bad people such as the Klan and law enforcement that was paid off. So the day that he was hanged, it was a beautiful April day, and there'd been a storm that had gone through, and white fluffy clouds were blowing over. And people felt that they could just get Birger, pin all the sins of the camp onto Charlie Birger, then they could turn a page. So here, this is the Benton Evening News, published on April 20th, 1928. Headline, Charlie Birger dies smiling. But then he goes into the first caption here, unexplainable gloom over city as hour of execution neared. And it talked about the day after, for some reason, people had just had the wind taken out of their sails, which is another unexplainable reason people like to talk about Charlie Birger. It's the unexplainable. Why are we standing here talking about him 88 years later? When smarter and better men have died and been forgotten by their grandchildren's generation. So then, contrast that, we're going to go upstairs to the cell, and can we go up to the cell? Now, Birger actually descended down these stairs here, and they went down into the basement and came up, and there was an opening or a side stair that led to the gallows. They had a estimated 5,000 people at the hanging. They had built a stockade fence around the gallows, originally thinking that a gang member might come and try to get him off, take him away. But then you couldn't even park, you couldn't get within. People were selling spots on their roof for 5 cents overlooking the gallows. So Birger came down these steps, but we're going to go to his cell where he was incarcerated for 1 year.
So do you think he would have had a pretty large army of guards around him as they were escorting him out?
They did. In fact, there were some pictures that showed up. Some of these very photos were pictures that were actually paid for by law enforcement, and they were tucked away, and for some reason they were not part of the National Archive, and they were not used, but they were later released. This is a picture adjacent to this property. Actually, it's across the street over here on East Main Street. And these are the people that had a line. But you talked, in the early days of this project, back in the 80s, many people who were able to talk to me at that time were young kids who stood and looked through the stockade fence. Mm-hmm. So this is the stockade fence that they built that's facing west. So you can imagine 5,000 people. People cut school, and these people climbed trees, and like squirrels, they climbed up into, it's amazing somebody didn't get injured doing that. So this is Birger's cell. Of course, this door wasn't here. That was later added when that was office space for the sheriff's office. So even though this is Birger's cell, they say that he was given, this door was closed, and he had free reign of his hallway almost all the time. So he stood at this very window. This gallows was constructed outside, and part of one of Gary DeNeal's interviews during the book signing when he published his second edition, some school kids climbed the gallows, and Birger looked out and exclaimed, "Get off of those are mine." And then when the builders were building the gallows, he said, "Build it strong, boys, those are for me." So he was an entertainer. People would come here and want to talk to Birger. People would come here and send up special meals, baskets full of food, because he was the only source of strength for the many minorities who came here, mostly Eastern Europeans, to work in the coal mines. So he was a hero, and he was more. He'd make a modern day politician because he calculated everything for effect. And so the day of the hanging, Charlie Birger, of course, had gone through this enduring trial, and the last episode of the courthouse was a sanity hearing where his attorneys advised him that if he could prove to the judge that he was not mentally sound, he could get a stay of execution and maybe be incarcerated for the rest of his life. And according to the court transcript, he went into the courtroom, you could hear a pin drop, And the judge said, well, Mr. Birger, Judge Miller, who later jumped out of a window of a tall building in Chicago with financial issues, said, we're here for a sanity hearing, what do you have to say for yourself? He said, Your Honor, he said, when I'm hanged, that is, if I'm hanged, I want you to bury me in a Catholic cemetery. And the judge said, why would that be, Mr. Birger? And he said, because that is the last place the devil would come looking for a Jew. And the court roared in laughter, and they took him back to be hanged. And you can see that he had one stay of execution. He was going to be hanged in March, and it was postponed until April. You see the original 100 men were deputized, and on that original ticket or card for them to get into the gate to see this, it had a prior date that had been marked out. In fact, I think it might have been October. I think it was like October the 20th. So Charlie was in his cell, and when the Arlie Boswell, the Williamson County State's Attorney, and Sheriff Pritchard came up to see him, he'd been up most of the night, and he was pacing his floor, and he had on an undershirt, or he had on a bathrobe and an undershirt, and he was pacing the floor. So Arlie Boss said, the sheriff said, how are you doing today, Mr. Birger? And he cursed, and he said, how in the GDH would you feel if this is your last day on earth? So they asked him if he would like a sedative, and Woolard contacted me a year or two ago, who was the grandson of a Mrs. Nurse Woolard. So on the 6th floor of the Wood Building, the 6-story building, you can see from this window, was Benton's first hospital. The new one, where our office is, was 29. And so this Woolard told me that his grandmother received the call, and she came over, climbed those steps, and had on a white nurse's uniform and had a towel with a syringe of morphine. And Charlie accepted that syringe of morphine, which changed his demeanor. He's pacing the floor. He looks out and sees a sea of people. So he put on a blue serge suit in just a matter of minutes, and he walked out smiling. And he was resolved to the fact that he was going to die. Came up the steps. He walked around the front of the gallows, and there's a picture of a rabbi. He was Jewish, and Rabbi Mazar came over and built it. There's a picture on this wall back here, of Rabbi Mazar. This would be a shot right here with this photo on the wall. So Birger rounds the gallows with Rabbi Mazar, and over to the right, in kind of the X or the cross of that support, is Phil Hanna. Phil Hanna is the hangman who during his career hanged over 100 men, and he was called the humane hangman because as a child he went with his father to a hanging, and it took the victim, prisoner, convicted 45 minutes to die. So he had a ratio of how far to drop a prisoner. Charlie had lost weight, so he ordered that hole should be dug at the bottom so that Birger his neck would snap. He had an assortment of nooses that he coated with beeswax. He had a special knot that he tied to the side so that the victim... So Charlie Birger, actually, when he got up on the gallows, shook hands with Phil Hanna and said, you're a good old boy, and if I have to be hanged, I'm glad that you're doing it. So, again, he looked up and he saw these white, fluffy clouds blowing over. He shook hands with the sheriff. He said, do you have any words? He said, I've forgiven everyone. He saw his friend H.V. Rathbone out in the crowd, who was a writer for a Harrisburg newspaper, and also Charlie's clothier, had a clothing shop in Harrisburg. And prior to that, the hangman asked if he wanted a black hood or a white hood, and he said, the black, of course, I don't want to look like no Kluxer. Didn't want to look like a Klansman. So he walked out, and again he had dressed and bravely walked up the gallows. And the morning of the hanging, the ambulance was, okay, he rounded the corner with Rabbi Mazar, and there was a wicker basket similar to the basket that we have for Joe Adams that later burned up in a funeral home fire. That was to take his body to the funeral home. And when he saw that basket, a reporter reported that he spat upon it. He turned the corner and he spit on top of this basket. But the ambulance that was supposed to take him away didn't show up because a violent storm had gone through that night, and a barn door had sprung open and injured a lady who almost died from the barn door hitting her. So they had to make way for an ambulance to finally pull up just right before he was hanged. So it's one of those days that you want to be alive, green grass, birds singing, white fluffy clouds. And he looked up about 10:30 in the morning, sun directly on him, And he looked out at the crowd and they said, "Do you have any final words?" And right before they put the hood over him, he said, "It is a beautiful world," which has baffled people, however could be explained with perhaps a shot of morphine. That Birger dropped into history as the last legal public hanging in Illinois on that very afternoon. And he would have, at the time, the means of execution at the time of his hanging was the electric chair, but since he had committed his crime in December of 1926, they used the means of execution that was in force at the time of his murder of Joe Adams. Committed many murders, but this was the one of which they made the issue. And Joe Adams was not a good mayor. He was a member of the Shelton Gang, housed an armored car, and had several murders under his belt. But so, no, it was the last and only hanging in Franklin County, and we had to borrow a gallows, which we now have on display. So that is the mystery of Charlie Birger. After he was hanged, 3 doctors, if you look at the book in here, this is where Birger was interviewed the night before the trial, the night before his hanging. And he did not trust reporters for some reason. He thought they'd slandered the news or didn't get things right. But he sure liked Roy Alexander, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, who drove over, and he came in this very room and granted an interview of Roy Alexander. And you notice in the cell we have a 78 record player, and the Jailer's song by Vern Dalhart was playing. And said that was droning, according to this coverage of the story. And then, ironically, Vern Dalhart, who was the hillbilly composer, a national composer, there's a record, recorded a song called The Hanging of Charlie Birger, which mentioned West City and Benton. So this was the very place. They reconfigured this lock since then, according to Sheriff Wilson. But this is one of the rare photos, the night before the hanging, that shows Birger's finger missing. And he lost his finger. He went into a drugstore in Harrisburg and saw a guy that he didn't like, and the guy smarted off to him evidently, and he hit the guy in the mouth, and Birger's hand was infected by hitting the man's tooth, and he almost lost his hand, but he lost that finger. And then over here is the jail record book. It misspelled his name, but this is the year prior to his hanging, where they logged or booked Birger into the jail. And while most prisoners were here for petty theft or disturbing the peace, his sentence was to be over to the right. On April 19th, what happened to him was he was hanged by the neck until dead, dead, dead. And dead is emphasized 3 times because 3 physicians, in order to have a legal Illinois hanging, 3 physicians they took a stethoscope, checked his heart, and signed a death certificate. So he was actually endured 3 examinations and had the signature of 3 doctors.
So would this photo have been taken, right? Is that
Yes.
the interview was being conducted?
By St. Louis Post-Dispatch.
Okay, and you notice his other fingernail, his finger here is in bad shape there too.
Right. Well, I mean, he was an expert horseman. He was tough. He was in a lot of fights, and I'm sure that he was injured many times.
Yeah.
He was only 48 years old.
Now, when they gave him the shot of morphine, what time do you think that occurred?
Just before the hanging.
So, okay.
In fact, the crowd had gathered, and the time was almost, they were probably within 30 minutes of the hanging. And then he was not in a good state and was offered and accepted that shot of morphine. I probably would have taken 2 of them. And this is really not a cell, but this is, the jailer would stay here and would lock the door from the inside, just to protect, for the protection in case something happened and someone could come in and overtake him. Here's the record, 78. It was produced on 3 labels. The Hanging of Charles Birger by Vern Dalhart.
Okay.
So that is Charlie Birger's story.
So after he was hanged, removed, do you have any idea like where he was taken immediately? Was he put in a morgue somewhere? Or?
Well, when we had our initial meeting back in 1993, to determine whether the county was going to give us this property, somebody said, well, we heard he really wasn't hanged, that it was a substitute body. Then someone was talking later in the documentary, The Legend of Charlie Birger, someone said that his ex-wife came up and gave him a cyanide tablet and all these different stories. And there was a man who said, in that hearing, that were covered by 3 radio TV stations, he said he was hanged because they took his body to the funeral home on South Main, the one that had the, he was a coroner, and said that his neck was stretched out a foot long. This was, an old man stood up and said, I know he was hanged because I was a little boy, and they took us back in the back, and said I saw him and his neck was stretched out like this. So they did take him to, for a final coroner's examination, and then they took him, he's buried in the Emmett Van Schell Cemetery, and it's a Jewish cemetery in St. Louis, corner of University in Handley.